Her Crown by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 6, The Flight into the Forest. Mr. Gates's long arm reached out as Ellen opened the car door. His hand clawed at her as she slid from the seat. It closed so hard that his thumb and fingers met through the paper wrapping of the loaf of bread, which was all that he caught. Ellen was out of the car and into the black pine woods. The forest was a bottomless lake of the blackest India ink. Ellen ran with her hands outstretched in front of her face. She slithered, slid, and scurried, heading uphill, diving around the great scaly trunks when her fingers touched them. Her feet slipped on the carpet of pine needles, which muffled her footsteps and kept her progress secret. They did the same for Mr. Gates, however, who was instantly through the door in pursuit. In this deadly race, Ellen soon realized that she had one advantage. She was short. The pine branches spread horizontally from the holes beginning at about 5 feet, the top of Ellen's head. At 55.5 inches, cleared most of them neatly, Mr. Gates, who was much taller, would have to bend forward. This evidently threw him off balance. Ellen heard him falling occasionally and sometimes crashing into tree trunks. Within a few minutes he was panting so loudly that she could hear quite easily where he was all of the time. He had run farther to the left than she had, and was now, she guessed, a couple 100 feet away. She ran a little farther and then stopped. If she could hear his breathing, then he would hear hers. If she ran too hard, she lay down on the ground and pressed her face into her hands and into the soft pine carpet, trying to breathe as gently as possible. After a while, Mr. Gates seemed to realize he was giving his position away. At any rate, she no longer heard him crashing about, and in a few minutes his puffing stopped. In all the dark woods there was not a sound. Even the wind had died. She lay absolutely still, hoping that the forest was big enough so that he would miss her. Was he standing still, listening, or was he searching silently now, creeping through the dark? A few minutes passed, and then she heard a noise, a dry rasping like two dead leaves rubbing together. It was Mr. Gates's hand touching the piney scales of a tree trunk as he felt his way forward. Now she heard his breath again, very softly, like the faintest of whispers. He could not be more than 6 feet away. It was too late to get up and run. Instead, she tried to make herself completely rigid, and she held her breath. The whisper came closer. She heard a muffled footstep, and then his hard, heavy shoe came down on her ankle, crushing it so that she thought it would snap, and the pain shot all the way up to her face. Still, she did not move nor breathe, and for once there was an advantage in being thin, for Mr. Gates either did not feel her small bone underfoot, or more likely thought it was only a pine bough. In a second or so, he lifted his foot, took another step, and crept on. When he had passed, she let the air from her lungs out slowly and inhaled again, working hard not to gasp. Just as she did this, he began calling very gently. He was perhaps 20 feet away. "Ellen!" And then again, "Ellen!" He said it sweetly, affectionately, as if she were his own daughter lost in the night. His voice was so high it sounded as if he were singing. "Ellen, please come out," the clear voice called. "I'm not going to hurt you. We've got to go on to Kentucky now." A pause, no sound at all. Then once more, "Ellen, don't you want to see your Aunt Sarah? I'm going to take you right to her house. You can be with her tomorrow morning. We're almost there. Please, Ellen, let's go on. You can't stay here alone in the woods." All this was spoken in the kindliest, most concerned voice, but there was one very odd thing about it. Ellen was almost certain that she had never told him her aunt's name. Yet how else could he possibly have known? She lay still, pressed against the ground. Something must have moved, however, or at least Mr. Gates thought something did. Perhaps some small animal, frightened by his calling. In any case, he gave a shout, and she heard him pounce and crash to the ground. Then he was off again, running blindly through the woods, chasing something he thought was Ellen, but moving now away from her, down the hillside. She took advantage of the noise to move carefully and quietly another 100 feet in the opposite direction, up the hill. After a few minutes, Mr. Gates stopped again, quite far away, so that she could hardly hear his panting. Once more he shouted into the woods, but this time in the strangest way, saying things that made no sense. to Ellen at all. There was nothing sweet about his voice now. He was screaming, "Ellen!" high and shrill. "You must come out! I order you to come out! The king has commanded me to bring you to him! The king himself has ordered it! You must come!" Then, like a chant, "You will come! You will come! You will come! If you don't come now, you will come later!" More silence, and then the same again. "You will come, or we will be punished." But when he spoke again, for the last time, he was no longer talking to Ellen, but to himself. In a whimper, "I will be punished. They will put me in the—" Was it the machine, he said, or screen? Ellen could not be sure, for at the word his voice broke entirely and turned into a weak, blubbering wail. Mr. Gates was hysterical. Still wailing, he blundered his way down the hill, and in a little while she heard the car start in the distance. The engine roared, the tires screamed terribly, and he drove off. Ellen climbed a little higher up the mountain, found a level spot, and sat down. The night was cool, but not cold. The pine carpet under her gave off warmth. It had collected during the day, and was as soft as a mattress. In a few minutes she lay back and fell asleep from exhaustion. She was free of Mr. Gates, but free she knew not where, in a wilderness with no food or drink. She had only her pocketbook left, looped fast around her wrist. While she slept, she had a nightmare. She stood in the throne room of her castle, which she recognized instantly, although it had been changed. The dais where the throne used to stand had been made much larger and higher and turned into a stage. On stage there was a hideous performance going on. 20 boys and young men, all wearing green hoods, were attacking a policeman who stood defenseless, dressed in blue, in the center. First 5 from the left, armed with clubs and knives, would dart in and circle the policeman like Indians, stabbing and beating viciously. Then, all together, they would slink away, and another 5 from the right would take their places. It was gracefully and swiftly done, like a ballet, but all in complete silence. The policeman, she finally realized, was not real. He was a dummy, a sort of practice policeman hung from the ceiling by a rope around his neck so that his head dangled off to one side. Now she saw that in the pit in front of the stage there was a director, positioned so low that only the top of the back of his head was visible. He wore a crown exactly like hers, except that it was black. And that is the end of Chapter 6.